They say power can corrupt a man. But what happens when that man has not only unimaginable power and wisdom, but also 700 wives and 300 mistresses? This isn't just a legend. It's the life of King Solomon, one of the most fascinating and complicated figures in the Bible. Loved by some, questioned by many, and remembered by all, Solomon's story is a whirlwind of glory, desire, wisdom, and downfall. But behind the grand temples and golden thrones lies a human heart pulled in 1,000 directions. Picture this: a young king, barely out of his youth, kneeling alone in the quiet of night. He doesn't ask God for wealth or power or revenge against enemies. He asks for wisdom, and God grants it. Not just ordinary wisdom, but divine understanding that sets Solomon apart from every ruler before and after him. His judgments become legendary, his words turn into proverbs, and his kingdom becomes the wealthiest and most admired in the world. But even as his mind overflows with wisdom, his heart starts wandering towards something else. The women. At first, they arrive as political alliances. Princesses and noble women from distant lands: Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and more. Each marriage a treaty. Each woman a promise of peace. And Solomon, strategic as he was, agreed to them all. But soon, it wasn't just politics. It became personal. Desire crept in. Curiosity. Lust. Love even. And what began as diplomacy slowly turned into something much deeper and far more dangerous. Can you imagine the palace? Hundreds of women, each with their own stories, their own traditions, their own gods. Solomon, the wisest man on earth, now surrounded by voices, expectations, and pressures beyond even his understanding. Some were queens with their own royal bloodlines. Others were mistresses with charm and mystery. How did he speak to all of them? How did he divide his time, his affection, his attention? And more importantly, how did he stay true to the God who gave him everything? The Bible doesn't give us every detail, but the hints are there. Solomon built them temples. He let them worship their own gods: Molech, Chemosh, Ashtoreth. He even joined them at times. The man who once built the grand temple of God in Jerusalem was now sacrificing in shrines he had sworn to destroy. Why? Was it love? Was it weakness? Or was it simply the cost of pleasing 1,000 women? The weight of so many relationships had a cost. These weren't just romantic flings. They were deep, tangled connections that shaped his daily life, his decisions, and eventually his faith. Some of these women were mothers to his children. Some were advisors in secret. Some carried influence strong enough to bend a king's will. What started as an empire of unity slowly became a kingdom divided, not on the outside, but in the king's own soul. And through it all, Solomon's wisdom remained. That's what makes it so strange, so tragic. He knew better. He wrote about the dangers of temptation. He warned about the seductive pull of foreign women. And yet, he couldn't pull himself away. The man who could judge the most complex disputes with clarity couldn't seem to judge the storm inside his own heart. There's a passage that still stuns people to this day. Asterisk, he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Asterisk, not just his attention, not just his schedule, his heart, the very center of who he was. That's not just about romance. That's about identity. That's about purpose. That's about a king losing the very thing that made him chosen. But maybe that's what makes Solomon so human. He wasn't a myth or a flawless saint. He was a man with incredible gifts and even greater temptations. He was wise but not immune, strong but not unbreakable. And when faced with the desire to love and be loved, he chose in ways that would haunt his kingdom for generations. So how did Solomon manage all those relationships? Was it strategy? Was it charm? Or was it simply surrender? Did he truly love them all? Or did the number become more important than the meaning? These are questions scholars and believers have asked for centuries. But the bigger question is this: what did all those relationships do to him? Because behind the gold, behind the fame, behind the Proverbs and Psalms, there's the sound of a man sighing late at night. A king who had everything, surrounded by everyone, and yet, somehow, still searching. And just when it seemed like his story had settled into glory, something shifted. A warning whispered through the palace walls. A betrayal rising in the shadows. A choice he would have to make between the God who gave him everything and the loves who slowly took it away. The fall didn't happen all at once. It started small. A glance. A favor. A shrine built where it shouldn't have been. But the cracks began to show. And what came next would change everything. What really caused Solomon's downfall? Who among those hundreds of women held the key to his greatest mistake? And could the wisest man in the world ever truly find peace in 1,000 voices calling his name? Long before Solomon's palace filled with women, before the incense of strange gods rose above Jerusalem, there was the young boy, son of David and Bathsheba, a child born out of a story marked by both tragedy and grace. Solomon wasn't supposed to be king. His older brothers had stronger claims. But somehow, the prophet Nathan and his mother Bathsheba intervened at just the right time. And David, in his old age, passed the crown to Solomon. It wasn't politics. It was destiny. Or so it seemed. The moment he took the throne, Solomon had choices. He could have ruled with power like his father David, fierce in battle, feared by nations. But instead, he asked God for understanding. That moment, quiet, sincere, full of humility, was the beginning of his rise. People came from everywhere just to hear him speak. He solved problems no one else could. Mothers trusted him. Soldiers obeyed him. Merchants admired him. Even queens from distant lands traveled weeks just to see the king who had answers no one else could give. But with fame came attention, and with attention came pressure. Kings from neighboring lands sent gifts and daughters, hoping to win Solomon's favor. At first, it was calculated. A marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh meant peace with Egypt. A union with a Sidonian princess meant secure trade routes. Every wife added another layer of protection to Israel's borders. But one by one, the alliances started to shift the atmosphere inside the kingdom. The women brought more than beauty. They brought culture, tradition, and gods. Chemosh, Molech, Ashtoreth, names that echoed in forbidden corners of the city. Temples began to rise outside Jerusalem, built not for the God of Israel, but for the gods of Solomon's wives. And though he still offered sacrifices at the temple, his heart began to split. Not all at once. Slowly. A peace here. A compromise there. Maybe it was just to keep peace at home. Maybe it was because he cared. Maybe it was just exhaustion from trying to please so many. Imagine walking through Solomon's palace. The sense of exotic oils drifting through the halls. Foreign languages whispered behind closed doors. Gold everywhere, yet a kind of restlessness in the air. Servants rushing to meet the needs of so many queens. Every woman with her own background, her own beliefs, her own place in his world. Some were quiet and observant. Others, bold and persuasive. And Solomon, caught between the God who made him king and the women who filled his days. Even his writings started to change. In Proverbs, he warned of women whose charm can lead a man astray. But in Ecclesiastes, there's a different tone. A tired voice. A man who has seen too much. He writes about chasing the wind, about pleasures that mean nothing, about wisdom that leads to sorrow. Was this the same man who once stood in awe of God, lifting his hands before the Ark of the Covenant? And yet, the most haunting part isn't that he lost control. It's that he may not have realized it until it was too late. There were whispers of rebellion. A young leader rising from within his own court. Discontent among the tribes. People wondering if the golden age was starting to fade. And all the while, Solomon stood at the center, still respected, still wise, but increasingly alone. Some say one woman had more influence than the rest, that it was her voice that pulled him furthest from his roots. But who was she? And why did she matter more than the hundreds of others? That's the question still left unanswered. And behind all of this is a deeper mystery. How could the wisest man who ever lived lose sight of what mattered most? The answer might lie not in politics or power, but in the quiet spaces between the verses. In the aching words of a man who had everything, yet couldn't hold onto himself. The next chapter in Solomon's story isn't just about a king. It's about a heart divided, and what happens when even the greatest wisdom in the world can't save a soul slowly slipping away. In the middle of all the gold, wisdom, and royal ceremonies, a silent conflict was growing, not just in Solomon's palace, but in his own spirit. The very gifts that once set him apart were now the things pulling him in opposite directions. On one side, the God of Israel who had walked with his father David, the God who gave Solomon wisdom, power, and peace. On the other, a growing crowd of foreign gods, rituals, and beliefs brought in by the women Solomon allowed into his life. He thought he could balance it all. But even the wisest man was not immune to the slow drift of divided loyalty. Inside the palace walls, things were no longer as peaceful as they seemed. The women, queens and concubines, weren't just sitting quietly. Many came from royal bloodlines of their own, daughters of kings and high priests. They didn't just bring love or beauty. They brought ambition. They wanted shrines for their gods. They wanted recognition. Some of them wanted influence over the decisions Solomon made. A few even whispered about their sons having a claim to the throne one day. And Solomon, tired and aging, began to give in, not out of fear but maybe out of fatigue. Behind the walls, jealousy was growing. When a man has 700 wives and 300 mistresses, not everyone can feel seen. The attention he once gave freely now had to be divided, carefully managed, and often rationed. Some women fought for his time. Others formed small alliances among themselves. A few withdrew into bitterness. The palace turned into a quiet battlefield of emotions, favors, and competition. And Solomon, once in full control, now found himself pulled in too many directions. Outside the palace, the people started to notice a change. Taxes were heavier. Work crews were stretched thin. Solomon's massive building projects, palaces, fortresses, and temples to foreign gods, needed labor. The people who once sang his praises now began to murmur in the markets. "What happened to the king who walked with God?" they whispered. "Why does he build temples to gods we do not know?" The spiritual center of Israel was shifting, and many feared it was moving in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the palace, a young official named Jeroboam was watching. He was sharp, ambitious, and respected by the workers Solomon had placed under his command. He saw the unrest. He heard the complaints. And he started to imagine something dangerous. What if the kingdom didn't stay united? What if someone else could rule part of it better? And it wasn't just Jeroboam. Prophets, long silent, began to stir again. One of them, Ahijah, had a message that would change everything. But that message hadn't been delivered yet. Not while Solomon was still king. Not while the palace was still full of voices competing for his soul. Back in the royal chambers, Solomon began spending more time alone. He wasn't writing proverbs anymore. He was reflecting. Ecclesiastes, the book many believe he wrote in his later years, feels like a man trying to make sense of a life that had slipped through his fingers. Meaningless, he wrote. Everything is meaningless. Not because he didn't understand life, but because he had seen what happened when even great wisdom wasn't enough to protect a man from his own heart. And all the while, tension continued to rise. Some of the women pushed harder, asking for more shrines, more influence, more voice in royal affairs. Others warned Solomon, quietly, urging him to return to the ways of his youth. But the conflict wasn't just between people. It was a spiritual struggle between loyalty and compromise, truth and comfort, devotion and desire. The priests who once guided the king in his youth now stayed mostly silent. Some feared him. Others had been replaced by those more willing to look the other way. The temple in Jerusalem still stood tall, still filled with offerings, but many began to wonder if God's presence had already begun to depart. And yet, even with all this unraveling around him, Solomon held on. Not to peace, not to clarity, but to a fragile order that threatened to collapse at any moment. Something was coming. A judgment. A shift. The kingdom stood on the edge, and Solomon, once the wisest man alive, was no longer sure which side he was on. The voices of his wives and mistresses echoed in his ears. His people grumbled under heavy burdens. And somewhere in the distance, a prophet prepared to speak the words that would change the course of Israel forever. But the king? He still had one more decision to make. The days in Jerusalem had grown heavy, not just from the heat, but from the silence of something no one could name. In the streets, the markets still buzzed, the palace gates still opened and closed, but beneath the surface, the heart of the kingdom was beginning to shake. Solomon sat on his throne, but he didn't smile like he used to. His eyes lingered longer in thought. His decisions came slower. And the people watching him, his officials, his wives, his servants, could feel it. Something was unraveling. Inside the palace, the women had stopped pretending everything was fine. The tension between them had reached its peak. Some argued openly, accusing each other of taking advantage of the king's old age. Others formed circles of loyalty, whispering in corners, pulling strings behind closed doors. One foreign queen, bold and proud, had even begun requesting an altar for her god to be placed within view of the temple itself. It was a line no one had dared to cross before. But now, with Solomon distracted and weakened, she saw her chance. And Solomon, tired, conflicted, burdened by the weight of his own choices, was losing grip. The very wisdom that had built his empire now seemed to weigh him down like a chain. He had tried to please everyone, tried to keep peace in the palace and in the nation. But in trying to avoid conflict, he had let it grow like a fire in a sealed room. Now it was burning, and was about to break loose. In the northern territories, Jeroboam's name was being spoken more and more. He had become a quiet symbol of hope to some, a dangerous rebel to others. He didn't claim power. Not yet, but people were watching him. Waiting. Solomon noticed it too. He had his spies. He heard the rumors. And one night, unable to sleep, he called for Jeroboam to appear before him. It was not a friendly meeting. The king stared at the young man for a long time, trying to see what others saw in him. Jeroboam bowed respectfully, but his eyes held something sharp, something Solomon recognized from his own youth. Fire, vision, restlessness. It was like looking at a younger version of himself, before the weight of 1,000 compromises. Solomon dismissed him without a word. But the next morning, Jeroboam was gone, fled, and it didn't take long for news to spread. The prophet Ahijah had met him on the road, alone, cloaked, and in a strange, silent act, he had torn his own garment into 12 pieces, handing 10 of them to Jeroboam. A sign, a prophecy, that the kingdom would be torn apart. 10 tribes would go to Jeroboam. Only 2 would remain with the house of David. Word of the prophecy reached the palace in whispers. Solomon was furious, not just at Jeroboam, but at the fate itself. How could the kingdom he built, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, be handed over to someone else? To a servant? A rebel? He ordered Jeroboam's death, but it was too late. The young man had vanished into Egypt, sheltered by Pharaoh. And yet, even with his anger burning, Solomon knew. Deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about him, his choices, his heart, the temples he had allowed to rise, the sacrifices he had let happen on hills that should have remained untouched, the foreign gods that now stood as tall as the temple of the Lord. And now, the consequences were here. Each night, the city of Jerusalem glowed with torches. Smoke from sacrifices curled into the sky from dozens of altars. Not all of them holy, not all of them welcome. And Solomon, standing at the highest point of his palace, looked down on the city he once united, now teetering on the edge of division. The God who once spoke to him in dreams had been silent. The people who once cheered his name now whispered in the dark. The women who once adored him now demanded more than he could give. And in the shadows, the kingdom waited, unsteady, uneasy, because it knew something was about to break. The wisest man on earth was out of answers. And the crown, once a symbol of peace and glory, now trembled with the weight of a storm he could no longer stop. Then came the twist no one expected. Not from within the palace, not from Jeroboam, not even from the people, but from within Solomon's own bloodline. Rehoboam, his son, the one many assumed would inherit everything, had begun stirring unrest of his own. Though still young and inexperienced, Rehoboam had grown up watching the kingdom shift. He saw his father lose his grip. He heard the priests argue behind closed doors. And instead of growing into a wise prince, he grew into something else, proud, impatient, and bitter. Rehoboam didn't see Solomon as the great king the world admired. He saw an old man clinging to power, haunted by regrets and drowned in palace politics. And deep in his heart, Rehoboam believed he could rule better, stronger, with fewer compromises, fewer apologies. He wasn't interested in pleasing every voice in the palace like his father had done. He wanted control, and he was already gathering the men who would help him take it. But Rehoboam wasn't the only threat rising from inside the royal bloodline. One of Solomon's lesser-known wives, quiet, observant, and mostly forgotten the Sea of Queens, had a son too. A bright, clever boy with charm and grace, raised far from the politics of the throne. Some in the palace whispered that he reminded them of David. Others said he was too gentle to survive court life. But someone powerful was paying attention to him, and she had a plan. This woman, Solomon's Sidonian queen, was no ordinary wife. She had grown up in a palace of her own, daughter of a high priest of Ashtoreth. She knew how power moved in silence. She knew how to wait, how to read people, how to sow doubt without ever raising her voice. And now, as Solomon grew weaker, she saw her opportunity. Her son could be king. Not Rehoboam, not Jeroboam, her son. A future where Israel was ruled not by the line of David, but by a new kind of king, one raised under her gods, her customs, her influence. And so, while the kingdom braced for Jeroboam's return, another quiet struggle was already underway within the palace itself. Solomon, sensing something was off, tried to regain control, but his health was failing. He barely left his chambers now. When he did speak, it was mostly to scribes trying to finish his writings, leaving behind thoughts that felt more like warnings than wisdom. Priests came and went, offering prayers. Servants walked carefully, avoiding any sign of division in front of the king. But behind the doors, lines were being drawn. Rehoboam had his supporters, mostly older men loyal to David's name. The Sidonian queen had hers, quiet influencers, servants with sharp eyes, women who owed her favors. And somewhere in the north, Jeroboam waited, not with an army, but with a promise. A divine prophecy that still lingered like thunder in the distance. Then, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in Jerusalem, written in a foreign hand, but bearing a seal from Egypt. It wasn't for Solomon. It was for the Sidonian queen. And though no one saw her read it, the change in her expression afterward didn't go unnoticed. She smiled. Not wide, not proud, but the kind of smile that meant something had shifted in her favor. Solomon heard about the letter. He asked to see it. She refused. For the first time, he realized he no longer ruled everything within his own walls. Outside the palace, the people grew restless. Some demanded lower taxes. Some began speaking Jeroboam's name out loud. And the elders, the old advisors who had once helped Solomon rise, now debated whether the prophecy was unfolding before their eyes. The kingdom wasn't just divided between north and south anymore. It was splintering on all sides, politically, spiritually, even within Solomon's own family. Every path forward looked dangerous. And Solomon? He watched it all from his window. The city he built, the temple he dedicated, the throne he once sat on with pride. It was all still there, but it didn't feel like his anymore. The wisest man in history stood at the edge of everything he'd created, knowing something was coming. Something final. But from where, and through whom, it would come, he still could not tell. The air in Jerusalem turned cold, not from weather, but from something deeper, a silence that felt like waiting. The city was tense, the palace uneasy, and Solomon, once strong and steady, now lay in his chambers, too weak to stand. He knew his time was short. Word had already reached his inner circle. Jeroboam had returned. Not with an army, but with something far more dangerous, belief. People believed he was chosen. People believed Solomon's reign was over. The elders gathered one last time at the palace. Rehoboam stood at the center, angry and defiant. He demanded loyalty. He demanded his right as heir. "This throne belongs to me," he shouted. But the room didn't respond the way he expected. Some elders looked away. Others exchanged glances. The silence said more than words. Rehoboam's pride had become his weakness. He didn't listen. He only commanded. That frightened those who remembered how Solomon once ruled with a careful heart. The Sidonian queen watched from the shadows, calm and unreadable. Her son stood behind her, quiet but observant. She hadn't made her move yet. She was waiting. She always waited for the perfect moment. And now, as the palace shifted under the weight of change, she sensed the final piece was about to fall. Then, the unexpected twist came, not from Rehoboam, not from Jeroboam, but from Solomon himself. Word spread through the palace. The king had summoned the high priest and his most trusted scribe. For hours, no one knew what was said behind the heavy doors. But when the scribe emerged, he carried a sealed document. A will. A final decree from the king. Everyone waited for it to be read. But before it could be made public, Solomon passed away quietly in his bed, his eyes open but still. The kingdom held its breath. At the official reading, Rehoboam stood tall, expecting to be named king without question. Jeroboam, hiding in the crowd, listened with careful ears. The Sidonian queen, surrounded by her allies, wore a look of confidence. Then the scribe broke the seal and read Solomon's final words. He named Rehoboam as king, but under strict conditions. The new king must consult the elders before making any decision affecting the people. He must remove the foreign altars from Jerusalem, and he must never raise taxes without agreement from the council. If he failed, the kingdom would split, and the Lord would honor his word to Jeroboam. The room exploded in shock. Rehoboam was furious. He called it weakness, betrayal, even cowardice. But the elders backed the king's final wishes. They had watched the kingdom suffer. They knew the cost of ignoring wisdom. Rehoboam took the throne, but within days, he broke his father's conditions. He rejected the advice of the elders and listened only to his younger, arrogant friends. He raised taxes. He ignored warnings. And just like the prophecy said, the kingdom shattered. 10 tribes turned their backs and followed Jeroboam, who became king over Israel. Rehoboam ruled only Judah and Benjamin. The once united kingdom of Solomon fell in two, torn not by war, but by pride and disobedience. The Sidonian queen fled with her son, her plans undone by Solomon's last move. Jeroboam, now king of Israel, quickly built golden calves in Bethel and Dan to keep his people from returning to Jerusalem. He had the throne, but not the wisdom. The same cycle of pride and division began again. In the end, Solomon's story wasn't just about wealth, women, or wisdom. It was about how power, when unchecked, can drift quietly from strength to ruin. The man who had it all, 700 wives, 300 mistresses, unimaginable riches, and a direct line to God, still lost his legacy. Not overnight, but one compromise at a time. And yet, even in the fall, one thing remained. The promise to David, that one day, from his line, a king would rise who would rule not with pride or fear, but with justice, truth, and peace that would never end. That part of the story was still to come. In the years that followed the Great Division, the legacy of Solomon became more complicated than anyone expected. People remembered him not only for his wisdom and wealth, but also for the way his story ended, with heartbreak, division, and lost unity. The temple he built still stood, its golden walls shining under the sun, a symbol of what once was. Pilgrims still came to pray, but the crowds were smaller. The feeling had changed. There was no longer one heart among the people. Only fragments. Rehoboam ruled Judah with a stubborn fist, but he never regained what his father lost. The people under his rule grew tired quickly, and though Jerusalem remained the capital, its glory faded. The once proud kingdom of David and Solomon now carried the burden of broken trust. Meanwhile, Jeroboam's rule in the north started strong, But he, too, let fear shape his decisions. He built new altars, not for God, but to protect his throne. Over time, his kingdom drifted into idolatry and confusion, just like the one he had left. As for the women of Solomon's palace, the 700 wives and 300 mistresses, their stories faded into silence. Some returned to their homelands. Others stayed behind, blending into the life of the city. A few were remembered by name, others only as shadows in the background of a powerful man's rise and fall. But each had played a role, no matter how small. Their presence shaped decisions, shifted loyalties, and challenged the king's focus. In many ways, they were not just part of Solomon's life, they were part of his legacy. The son of the Sidonian queen was never crowned. He disappeared from records, but not from memory. Rumors said he fled to the coast. Others claimed he became a teacher far from politics. Whatever the truth, he never returned to the palace. His mother's ambition, once so strong, faded in the light of a dream that had slipped through her hands. And yet, despite the political chaos and personal failures, something greater still lingered in Solomon's story. His writings, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, the Song of Songs, continued to speak across generations. People read his words and found pieces of themselves in them. They saw the joy, the sorrow, the questions, and the longing. Meaningless, he had written in his later years. Everything is meaningless. But those same words pushed people to look deeper, to find meaning not in wealth or power, but in purpose, in faith, and in wisdom that lasts. In the end, the man who had 700 wives and 300 mistresses, who built temples and cities, who ruled the most powerful kingdom of his time, was remembered not just for what he gained, but for what he lost. His story became a warning and a mirror, a reminder that even the wisest among us can be led astray, and that choices, no matter how private, always echo through history. And yet, from the broken pieces of Solomon's reign, a promise still remained. A flicker of hope passed down through his bloodline, waiting for the day when a true king would come, not just to rule, but to restore. That day was still far off, but the story of Solomon left behind the question that would keep generations searching. How does a man so rich in wisdom lose his way? And how do we keep from doing the same? That was the end of Solomon's story. But for the people who came after, the lessons had only just begun.